Last week, we learned about some features of sexual orientation. This week, I hope to apply some of what we've learned to understanding why sexual orientation may exist, theories that attempt to explain the prevalence of differences in sexual orientation between humans and non-humans. I want to first by stating that there are many of these theories, and to be quite honest, none of them has done a perfect job of describing why sexual orientation exists or why we see it manifesting in the particular way that it does, in the frequency that it does within the population. Throughout the history of theorizing about sexual orientation, there have been two broad categories of theory. Ones that were considered psychodynamic, that is, relying on an explanation of the internal mental processes that lead to variation in sexual orientation. And then more recently, we've had theories that rely on biological explanations, that is, studying differences in brain circuitry, in hormone concentrations and circulation throughout the body, both prenatally, that is, before birth, and then after birth as well, especially during adolescence and throughout the life. Genes as well have been shown to influence the inheritance and the manifestation of sexual orientation. And then, of course, some theories that tap into the evolution of sexual orientation, to the degree that evolution has shaped sexual behavior, and it seems to have done so quite strongly. There must be perhaps an explanation for why it is a trait that persists within humans and other animals. So the psychodynamic theories have had a checkered past, such that they were influential for quite a while, but they've lost much of their influence, largely because they've not led to the generation of evidence to support them, which is what a good theory should do. So very early on, the thought was that sexual orientation, or specifically homosexuality, was a disruption of normal psychosexual development. That is, most people are on this path toward the development of a heterosexual orientation, attraction to the opposite sex, and if you experience anything other than that, it must have been because of some problem experienced during development. Perhaps there were not enough nutrients, or there was wrong exposure to the concentration of various hormones or other substances that can affect prenatal development. Perhaps early life experiences, sexual assault, things like that. Or later on, maybe being unsuccessful in the mating market as you go through adolescence and then start looking for potential partners. And if you can't get opposite sex partners, perhaps go for same-sex ones instead. These have been widely popularized in some communities, and these ideas have spread, but currently we don't have much evidence for them. It seems to be that sexual orientation more so is something that is heritable, so that is, it is a developmental trajectory that you have from very early on, and it's not necessarily a disruption or that something went wrong. Rather, this is its own form, its own morph of a particular trait. Some evidence has been acquired for explanations that rely on socialization or early sexual experiences. But again, much of this evidence has either not been well replicated, that is, it was shown a few times, but it does not consistently replicate again and again, or these theories have not comprehensively explained the many different situations in which sexual orientation can differ. So, for example, with socialization, there is the idea that if you are in an environment such as prison, where you do not have access to opposite sex partners, that you might see more homosexual behavior within prisons. This does seem to be supported. But does this do a good job of explaining how homosexuality manifests outside of prisons? That is not as well established. So there's some explanatory value here, but how well it applies to explaining the vast majority of differences between people in their sexual orientation is not well established. What we do have the most evidence for, and these are the theories that I will focus on within this lecture, are those that rely on hormonal or genetic influences as explanations for why we see certain types of sexual orientation. In many cases, these theories do not necessarily describe the origins of sexual orientation, that is, why it exists, but they all do, to a greater or lesser degree, a good job of explaining in what situations will we expect same-sex attraction to emerge? What kinds of hormonal profiles, what combinations of genes, and what those genes code for in terms of brain development are going to lead to differences in sexual orientation. So we'll go over that. I want to right away address this question that many people ask, and there seems to be, at this point, good evidence for answering, is homosexuality largely caused by genes? That is, are you born that way? Or is it shaped by environmental influences? Does something happen throughout life that ultimately pushes you towards a heterosexual or opposite sex attraction or same-sex attraction? And I want to, what I would do very generally is direct you to this article written by Bailey and colleagues titled Sexual Orientation, Controversy, and Science. This was an article published in 2016, but it was written for a number of policy leaders, country leaders outside of the Western world who really wanted to know, what do we know about sexual orientation and what do we know about the causes of it and ultimately how it affects society? Because if you are a policymaker, you will want to know, is this a behavior that we need to restrict, or is this a behavior that we need to somehow govern over? The short answer to that is no, you don't need to govern over it. But one of the bits that I want to pull out from here is some evidence that they discuss when it comes to twin studies. For those of you who do not realize what or have never heard of a twin study is a study where you take two individuals, identical twins, who share 100% of their genes. So an identical twins have 100% of their genes shared. And you examine how much those twins differ on various attributes based on whether they grew up in the same environment or a different environment. What twin studies allow us to do is really to hold genetic differences constant within an experimental design. That is, we know that identical twins will have 100% of differences in their genes, so any differences that we observe between them must be due to some difference in their environment. So they've used twin studies to examine this question of, well, how much do genes versus environment contribute to sexual orientation? And what we found, surprisingly, is that there certainly is a genetic contribution, and the estimates range between something like 30 to 50% of the differences between people are due to genetic causes. But then there actually is a substantial portion of differences between people that appear to be due to environmental or social reasons or cultural reasons, experiences that someone has had while growing up. Now, those of you who may believe that sexual orientation is a largely genetically controlled trait, there is support for that. But there's also this large portion of differences between people that is really unaccounted for. Are there experiences that you can have throughout life that are going to shift your sexual orientation? This is unsurprising if you think about the prevalence of sexual fluidity, which is the tendency for your sexual orientation to change. This does happen, and it happens frequently. And as people become more comfortable talking about and identifying as bisexual, usually this is what you see is, particularly among women, willingness to identify themselves as having these sexually fluid experiences. And chances are there are circumstances about one's life that might push you towards exclusive attraction to opposite or same sex, but then in other cases, attraction to something else. So the short answer is yes, there are genetic contributions to sexual orientation, but there are also a large amount of environmental influences that we have not yet documented and we just don't understand yet. One of the most influential hypotheses for understanding why sexual orientation manifests in the way that it does is what's called the organizational hypothesis. And this stipulates that differences observed between people in sexual orientation may reflect differences in sexual differentiation of the brain under the influence of prenatal hormones. So that is, differences in how people's brains develop based on the hormones that they were exposed to in the womb. So things like the concentration of estrogen and testosterone and progesterone. What we know so far from what we've learned in this class is that attraction to a particular sex is a gender typical trait. That is, if you are a male and you are attracted to women, then you have a male typical attraction. Men tend to be attracted to women, and vice versa. Women attracted to men tend to have a female typical attraction. So if you have same-sex attraction as a male, you are a male with a female typical type of attraction. This is consistent with what we know about how prenatal hormones affect the development of attraction to one sex versus the other. So in utero, high levels of androgens, remember that these are testosterone, the male typical hormone, are associated with greater attraction to women. And so development of this male typical trait, whereas low levels of this trait, of this hormone, tend to be associated with attraction to men. This can actually be manipulated using this knowledge. They've manipulated exposure to androgens within rats, and they are able to manipulate the sexual orientation of rats via this fetal androgen exposure, this exposure to testosterone early on in development. Another line of evidence comes from CAH women. Remember that this is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. These are women whose adrenal glands produce more testosterone than they otherwise should. And so CAH women are more likely to be attracted to same-sex individuals than those who do not have CAH or controls. There are also some differences in brain structure, as I mentioned, that are influenced by exposure to these hormones. One area of the brain that has been consistently associated with same-sex attraction in men is the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. This develops under prenatal testosterone exposure to be larger in men, but it's smaller in gay men than straight men. And so it seems that, but not so much for women. So this is a unique difference specific to gay men, but doesn't seem to explain differences in heterosexual versus lesbian women. So there is a bit of more complexity to why people develop the sexual orientation that they do than simply are they exposed to these hormones. But hormones do seem to shape brain structures responsible for sexual orientation in at least some individuals. There is also some support for the contribution of other types of hormones. In particular, I want to mention development of same-sex attraction among those who are exposed to different who have trait levels of progesterone, P. So this is the hormone that is associated with the luteal phase of a woman's menstrual cycle. So among heterosexual adults, trait progesterone, that is the amount of progesterone that they have just normally throughout the day, is associated with both desire to bond with others and openness to engage in homosexual relationships. This, remember I mentioned one possible explanation for homosexuality is the alloparenting hypothesis. That is, women may be more likely to experience same-sex attraction to other women if that attraction would have helped with parental care, such that if you have women who are sexually involved with one another, then they may be more willing to commit and build these social ties that then provide support to the children that they have. Well, it's possible that to the degree that progesterone is higher, and that is going to be higher during the phase in which the woman is likely to become pregnant, or perhaps is pregnant, the luteal phase, then this may be a mechanism motivating women to form these same-sex bonds during this time when they need that support. Of course, this is not a hole in one for this theory. I wouldn't necessarily interpret this as canon, as an absolute evidence for the alloparenting hypothesis, but it is a possibility, and it is something that we observe. There's also, and this is probably, at least for gay men, the hypothesis that has the most empirical support, the fraternal birth order effect. What is documented consistently is that for each older brother, but not a sister, that a man has, this increases the chance of homosexuality by about 33%. No evidence for this among women. So the idea is the more older brothers you have, the more likely you yourself are to experience same-sex attraction. Well, the logic for this is that remember that in utero, for a male to develop, it needs to be exposed to androgens. And so androgens are, for women, for the mother, a foreign substance. It's a foreign chemical. There's not as much testosterone naturally in the woman's body as you would see circulating within the womb, within the uterus, while the male child is developing. And so the first time that this happens, that testosterone, it gets to freely be within the womb and affect the fetus as it would normally affect it, almost unhindered. But one of the things that the immune system will do is when it comes into contact with a foreign substance, is it will begin to build antibodies to that substance. And so in the future, the body is now prepared to fight off whatever that substance was. This is how your immune system fights off any pathogen, any disease-causing agent. Well, the idea here is when the first son is born, the woman was not able to fight off this increased concentration of testosterone, but by the time the second male child comes around, her immune system is already prepared to inhibit the action of that testosterone. And so, not by virtue of the child releasing less testosterone, but the mother actually fighting the effects of testosterone, the testosterone that is released within the womb and helps with male typical development is going to be weaker. It's not going to be able to do its job as well. So the idea is with each male child, the woman's body gets more competent at fighting off testosterone. Therefore, the child is not, the son within the womb is not exposed to as much testosterone as the earlier sons were. Therefore, if you're not exposed to as much as this androgen, you're not going to potentially develop that extremely sex-typical, male-typical pattern of attraction to the opposite sex. You'll see more same-sex attraction. Again, this theory we have the most support for, but why this happens the way that it does, whether this is just a byproduct, something that happens as a consequence of the mother reacting to levels of testosterone, or whether this is an evolved trait, we do not know yet. Another influence is the fetus's genes may influence either the concentration of prenatal hormones that are present in the womb or androgen sensitivity. Remember that for testosterone to do its job, it needs to be recognized by the body. Well, some individuals may have genetic traits that make them less sensitive to androgen. Therefore, they will not have their brain, the organization of their brain will not be shaped as male typically as it otherwise would be. And a lot of this evidence comes again from looking at identical twins who share the same sexual orientation more often than other siblings. Other just normal siblings, fraternal twins, and also just regular old siblings share 50% of their genes. Identical twins share 100% of their genes. And so you see that there is some genetic contribution to the development of sexual orientation. And there may be other genetic influences as well, but these are, again, not as well understood as the hormonal influences, which are easier to study in some regards. There are differences in brain circuitry, and I want to highlight this study for anyone who just really enjoys research on the neurochemistry, the neurobiology of the development of various psychological traits. This is a recent article that summarizes what we know about the neural circuitry that encodes for sexual preference. And down at the bottom within this abstract, you'll see a number of structures that are that have been connected to opposite and same-sex orientation, sexual orientation. And so I encourage you to read this article on your own time. All right. A final few number of hypotheses I want to emphasize. One, which these last two, really these last three that I'm going to present, are explanations, potential explanations for how same-sex sexual orientation may have evolved. That is, why are these genes preserved within the human lineage? The first is called the sexually antagonistic selection hypothesis. And this idea is that homosexuality is a byproduct. It's not necessarily an adapted trait as it's being expressed, but rather that when the genes that contribute to homosexuality in men, in particular, are expressed within women, then she will benefit from improved reproductive success. In other words, if a man develops same-sex attraction, a female typical trait, so a male attraction to men is a female typical trait, then what may happen is that having those traits within the male's genes, if he goes and then reproduces with a woman and has a female child, then that female child is more likely to inherit those female typical traits, and therefore the female child will have a heads up in their reproductive success. So in other words, those genes that lead to homosexuality are not adaptive for the purpose of being attracted to the same sex, but rather that the male can be a carrier for those genes. A carrier so that if they get passed on to a female child, that female child is likely to do well, be reproductively successful. So there's some evidence for this showing that women with homosexual male relatives do tend to produce more offspring. So to the extent that those that female typical male attraction is present within other men within that same genetic lineage, women do tend to produce more offspring there. And another bit of evidence is that genes that contribute to homosexuality are located on the X chromosome. So that is, it's not going to be uniquely passed to men. This is a trait that will also get expressed in women as well. Another hypothesis that tries to get at the evolution of same-sex attraction is the kin selection hypothesis. And this proposes that if homosexuals invest more in their kin group than heterosexuals, they will improve the probability that their genetic relatives will reproduce. This is born from literature showing that homosexual men, homosexual women, or homosexual men in particular, do not tend to have more children than heterosexual men, which is unsurprising. If you are attracted to men and you attempt to reproduce with men, you will not be successful. However, if you yourself do not reproduce, there is another way for copies of your genes to enter the next generation, and that is through supporting your kin, those who are genetically related to you, your brothers and sisters. So the idea here is, rather than produce your own children, copying your own copies of your genes, what you do is you may take on the role, be more likely to take on the role of a caregiver or an aunt or uncle of your siblings' offspring. So by promoting their relatives, homosexuals indirectly promote their own genes, thus passing them into subsequent generations. The evidence for this is mixed. It's not as strong. The evidence that supports it you often see within non-Western, non-industrialized populations, such as the Fa'afafine of Western Samoa. I've talked about these before. Within this population, you see a third gender, such that there are men, biological men, who express interest in identifying themselves as female. And these individuals do often act as alloparents. That is, they often take on something of a nanny role or a caregiving uncle role within this society. However, within Western culture, you actually see that homosexual individuals are less investing in their kin. And so it's possible that this hypothesis explains sexual orientation within non-Western cultures, but it doesn't do a good job of universally explaining the differences in sexual orientation. So not as strong, but it's okay. A final recent hypothesis I want to introduce, and I'd love to talk about this during our discussion, is this, that traditionally in the evolutionary view, it's been framed that heterosexuality is the default option, that people, through evolution, those who reproduced with the opposite sex were most likely to reproduce. Therefore, homosexuality, same-sex attraction, may actually be a byproduct or a deviation from that kind of heteronormative style of mating, whereby heterosexuality is presumed the norm. Well, this hypothesis flips that on its head and argues that, well, perhaps heterosexuality was not the original form of attraction, that rather attraction was something that was more indiscriminate within our ancestral past, such that people were attracted to individuals of the same and opposite sex. The big benefit of this, they argue, is that if you are attracted to same-sex individuals and you engage in sexual activity with same-sex individuals, that can help to build strong collaborative bonds. So that is, same-sex attraction may be adaptive to the degree that those who are romantically involved actually have closer ties. They're more likely to support each other, and therefore same-sex attraction may be adaptive in that sense. Then, from that indiscriminate attraction, people then evolve the capacity to be attracted specifically to the opposite sex for the purpose of prioritizing reproduction over that collaboration and building strong social ties. This is a relatively new hypothesis, and it has undergone some criticisms. I've put down one of the responses, one of the criticisms to this article below here. I recommend, if you're interested in this topic, read this article. It's a very good read. It presents some good ideas, in my personal opinion, but also read the criticisms as well. They tend to bring up some good points about the limitations of this idea. So are there other explanations for how sexual orientation develops or why it exists? Absolutely. None of these theories are perfect, and they've only at best had mixed support. So perhaps one of the things that we can do during discussion this week is throw out some more ideas. Discuss which ones you find having the most merit and which explanations we've skipped over. We'll do that this week.